The mist hung low over the narrow crossing at Stamford Bridge on the morning of September 25, 1066. The river Derwent moved quietly beneath the wooden planks, reflecting a pale northern sky that gave no warning of what was about to unfold. On one side stood a Viking army, hardened warriors who had already tasted victory days earlier at Fulford. Many of them believed the campaign was nearly won. York had submitted. Tribute was expected. The threat to England seemed unstoppable. But across the rolling fields, another force was moving fast. King Harold Godwin's son had marched his army nearly 185 miles from the south in a matter of days, driving his men with relentless urgency. The Vikings did not expect him. Some had left their heavier armor behind. Others rested near the riverbank, confident and unprepared. What followed would become one of the most dramatic clashes in medieval history. Axes would rise. Shields would splinter. And a king from Norway, Harald Hardrada, would stake everything on this narrow strip of land. By sunset, the fate of the Viking Age itself would hang in the balance. Harald Hardrada was not an ordinary king seeking opportunity. By the time he set his sights on England in 1066, he had already lived a life forged in exile, war, and ambition. Born in 1015 in Norway, he was the half-brother of King Olaf II. As a teenager, he fought at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where Olaf was killed and Harold was forced to flee. Defeat did not weaken him. It hardened him. He traveled east, eventually reaching the Byzantine Empire, where he joined the elite Varangian Guard in Constantinople. There, he fought in brutal campaigns across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to the Middle East. He gained wealth, reputation, and a deep understanding of organized warfare. Byzantine discipline, strategy, and siege tactics shaped him into something more than a raider. He learned how empires operated, how cities were governed, and how power could be seized and held. When he returned to Scandinavia in the 1040s, he was no longer a displaced noble. He was wealthy, experienced, and feared. By 1046, he became King of Norway. Yet ruling Norway was not enough. Harold believed himself destined for greater achievements. His ambition stretched beyond fjords and mountains. The death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066 created an opening. England did not have a clear, uncontested successor. Harold Godwin's son took the crown, but across the Channel, William of Normandy claimed it was rightfully his. Harald Hardrada also asserted a claim, based on earlier agreements between Scandinavian and English rulers. Whether that claim was legally strong mattered less than his belief in it. He saw division. He saw opportunity. And he saw glory waiting on English soil. To strengthen his position, Harold formed an alliance with Tostig Godwin's son, the exiled brother of King Harold. Tostig knew England's weaknesses. Together, they prepared a massive fleet, reportedly around 300 ships. This was no simple raid for silver. It was an invasion designed to take a throne. Harald Hardrada had spent decades preparing for greatness. In 1066, he intended to claim it. England in 1066 was not a united fortress ready to repel invasion. It was a kingdom strained by uncertainty and divided by ambition. When Edward the Confessor died in January without a direct heir, the balance of power shifted overnight. Harold Godwin's son, the most powerful noble in England, moved quickly and was crowned king. But his claim was contested almost immediately. Across the English Channel, William of Normandy insisted that Edward had promised him the throne. To the north, Harald Hardrada believed earlier agreements between Scandinavian and English rulers gave him a legitimate right as well. This was not simply a struggle between three men. It was a test of England's stability. The kingdom itself was divided into powerful earldoms, each governed by regional leaders with their own loyalties and rivalries. In the north, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria held significant authority, yet their influence did not always align perfectly with the king's. Meanwhile, Tostig Godwin's son, Harold's own brother, had been driven into exile after alienating northern nobles. Bitter and determined, Tostig sought allies who could help him reclaim influence. He found that ally in Harald Hardrada. For Hardrada, this fractured political landscape was an invitation. He understood that England could not concentrate its defences in every direction at once. A strike in the north would force Harald to respond, potentially weakening the south. Timing was everything. In September 1066, Hardrada's fleet crossed the North Sea and entered the River Tyne before sailing south toward the Humber estuary. The sheer size of the force, hundreds of ships filled with seasoned warriors, sent a wave of fear through northern England. This was not a fleeting coastal raid. It was an organized campaign aimed at dismantling resistance piece by piece. The Vikings moved strategically, choosing landing sites that allowed quick inland movement and supply access. Their arrival was calculated to exploit England's political fractures. While Harold Godwin's son watched the southern coast for William's invasion, the north faced a different storm entirely. The trap was set. England would soon discover that its greatest vulnerability was not its walls, but its divisions. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwin's son pushed deeper into northern England with confidence. Their fleet had sailed into the Humber estuary and advanced along the River Ouse, positioning themselves within striking distance of York, one of the most important cities in the north. The local earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, quickly gathered their forces to block the Viking advance. They understood that if York fell, the north would be exposed. The two armies met on September 20 at the Battle of Fulford, just outside the city. The terrain was uneven and marshy, narrowing the space where the English could deploy effectively. Hardrada used this to his advantage. His warriors formed a disciplined shield wall, overlapping wooden shields to create a solid defensive barrier. Behind it, men armed with long spears and the fearsome two-handed Dane axes waited for the moment to strike. When the clash came, it was fierce and chaotic. The English lines initially resisted, but the Vikings pressed steadily. Hardrada's experience showed in the coordination of his troops. They adapted to the terrain and exploited weaknesses along the English flank. As pressure mounted, parts of the English force began to break. Once the shield wall fractured, Viking momentum became unstoppable. By the end of the day, Edwin and Morcar were forced to retreat, and the road to York lay open. The victory at Fulford was decisive. York soon submitted, agreeing to provide hostages and supplies. For Hardrada, this confirmed that his campaign was working exactly as planned. He had defeated a regional army and secured a major city within days of landing. But confidence can be dangerous. Believing the immediate threat neutralized, the Vikings moved to Stamford Bridge, east of York, to collect the promised hostages. Many warriors relaxed. Some removed their heavier armor. They did not expect Harold Godwin's son to arrive so quickly from the south. What Hardrada did not yet know was that the English king had already begun a forced march north, driving his army with relentless speed. The next confrontation would not resemble Fulford. It would test whether Viking momentum could survive surprise. On September 25, 1066, the Viking army gathered near Stamford Bridge expecting negotiation, not annihilation. After their victory at Fulford and York's submission, they believed the north was under control. Many had left portions of their armor behind with the ships at Rickcall, several miles away. Helmets were loosened. Mail coats were set aside. The atmosphere was confident, almost relaxed. Then the warning came. Dust rising in the distance. Banners approaching faster than expected. Harold Godwin's son had marched his army nearly 185 miles from southern England in just days, pushing his men with relentless urgency. The speed of his advance shocked the Vikings. They had not anticipated such a rapid response. The clash began at the narrow wooden bridge spanning the River Derwent. According to later accounts, a lone Viking warrior stood on the bridge and held off the English advance, wielding a massive axe and cutting down anyone who tried to cross. Whether embellished or not, the story reflects the desperation and ferocity of the defense. Eventually, the English managed to outflank the position, forcing their way across. Once the main forces engaged, the battlefield became chaos. The Vikings scrambled to form a shield wall, locking their shields together as English troops pressed forward. Without full armor and caught off guard, their usual discipline was tested. Harald Hardrada fought fiercely, reportedly wielding a great two-handed axe. He had survived decades of warfare across continents, but Stamford Bridge would not be another victory. In the midst of battle, an arrow struck Hardrada in the throat. The King of Norway fell. Leadership fractured instantly. Tostig Godwin's son attempted to rally the men, but he too was killed in the fighting. Without their commanders and without preparation, the Viking lines began to crumble. Reinforcements eventually arrived from the ships, rushing to the battlefield in full armor, but the momentum had already shifted. The English army, driven by urgency and revenge, overwhelmed the remaining resistance. By the end of the day, the ground around Stamford Bridge was covered with the dead. What began as a confident occupation had turned into catastrophe. The Viking dream of conquering England collapsed on that narrow crossing, beneath a grey northern sky. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was not only a clash of ambition, it was a study in strategy, preparation, and psychological shock. Viking warfare had long relied on discipline within the shield wall. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping shields into a solid barrier that absorbed enemy impact. Behind that wooden wall, spears thrust forward while men wielding heavy Dane axes waited for openings. The two-handed axe, capable of splitting shields and helmets, had become a symbol of Norse battlefield dominance. In open combat, this formation was difficult to break. But at Stamford Bridge, the Vikings were not fully prepared to deploy their strength. Many had left their heavier mail armor and helmets near the ships at Rickcall, believing negotiations would follow. That decision proved devastating. When Harold Godwinson's forces appeared unexpectedly, the Vikings were forced to form ranks quickly, without full protection. Surprise became the English king's greatest weapon. Harold's rapid march north had been a calculated risk. By moving his army nearly 185 miles in record time, he exploited Viking overconfidence. The psychological effect was immediate. An army that believed itself victorious suddenly faced a fresh and determined opponent. The English troops, driven by urgency and loyalty to their homeland, struck with momentum. Their own shield wall advanced steadily, pressing against Viking lines before they could stabilize. Terrain also played a role. The narrow bridge initially restricted movement, slowing the English advance and allowing a brief heroic defense. But once the crossing was secured, open ground favored the larger, better prepared force. Exhaustion compounded the problem for the Vikings. Some had marched from Fulford only days earlier, and now they fought under the weight of sudden chaos. Leadership proved decisive. Harald Hardrada had commanded through presence and experience, inspiring confidence. His death shattered that unity. Tostig's fall further destabilized morale. In medieval warfare, the death of a king often signaled defeat. Once the banner dropped, resolve weakened. Stamford Bridge demonstrated that even the most feared warriors could falter when caught unprepared. Viking tactics were formidable, but strategy without vigilance became vulnerability. Surprise, speed, and morale, tools once mastered by Norse invaders, had been turned against them. When the fighting finally ended at Stamford Bridge, the scale of the loss became painfully clear. The Viking army that had arrived with hundreds of ships was shattered. So many warriors lay dead that, according to later accounts, only about 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The rest of the fleet stood empty, a silent reminder of how quickly ambition had turned to disaster. For Scandinavia, the defeat was not just military. It was symbolic. One of its most experienced and feared kings had fallen on foreign soil. Harald Hardrada's death marked more than the loss of a commander. It represented the collapse of a final great attempt to seize England through direct Viking conquest. For decades, Norse rulers had tested English defenses, carved out territories, and even ruled as kings. Now, that era was ending in blood along the river Derwent. Yet the consequences did not stop there. Harold Godwin's son had achieved a stunning victory, but it came at a cost. His army had marched with extraordinary speed and then fought a brutal battle. The men were exhausted. Supplies were strained. There was little time to recover. Only weeks later, another invasion force landed in the south. William of Normandy had crossed the Channel and begun his own campaign. Harold was forced to march again, this time toward Hastings. The exhaustion from Stamford Bridge would linger in the ranks. On October 14, 1066, the English king who had defeated the Vikings would fall in battle against the Normans. In a cruel twist of fate, the victory at Stamford Bridge indirectly paved the way for Norman conquest. By destroying Hardrada's army, Harold removed one threat, but weakened himself against another. Across Europe, the news traveled. The era of large-scale Viking invasions had reached its breaking point. Scandinavian power would continue, but no future king would attempt such a bold conquest of England again. Stamford Bridge became remembered not only as a battlefield, but as a turning point. The old Viking world had clashed with a changing Europe, and Europe would never be the same. In the years that followed, Stamford Bridge came to symbolize the end of an age. The Viking warriors who had once dominated coastlines and rivers across Europe were no longer unstoppable invaders. They had become kings, settlers, and traders integrated into the political fabric of the continent. The great era of sudden northern conquests was fading. Harald Hardrada, often remembered as the last great Viking king, embodied that final surge of ambition, a warrior shaped by exile, hardened in distant empires, and driven by the dream of one more crown. His fall on English soil marked a shift in power that echoed far beyond the battlefield. Within weeks, England would pass into Norman hands, reshaping its language, culture, and ruling elite. The Viking Age did not vanish overnight, but its defining pattern of large-scale invasions ended on that narrow bridge. Today, the river Derwent flows quietly beneath Stamford Bridge, its waters betraying no trace of the clash that changed Europe's course. But history remembers. It remembers the march, the surprise, the fallen king, and the moment when an era closed in blood and steel. If you enjoyed this story, like and subscribe for more untold history.